this episode where we will reveal the authentic sound of Vivaldi beyond the trends of historical interpretation and get to know up close the most famous Italian composer of all time. Additionally, we will have with us our first guest, the young violin virtuoso José Fraguas. I am Jakob, conductor, cellist, and writer. This is the fourth episode of The Music of Your Life. The first thing we will explain is the reason for his popularity. Let's start by defining that the term baroque did not exist in his time. It is a term with a negative and derogatory connotation that was coined later, referring to the music of that era as heavy and difficult. Consider that it was the era of counterpoint, one of the most complex compositional systems, and also the era of the fugue, undoubtedly the most elaborate musical form in the history of music. When we listen to Vivaldi, we hardly find fugues, and his use of counterpoint is limited compared, for example, to many of the great composers of his time, such as Bach or Handel. So in reality, Vivaldi's style resembles classicism much more. We can verify this, for example, with this movement from the famous Four Seasons, Winter, specifically in the version by José Fraguas on solo violin and myself conducting baroque ensemble. The accompanied melody, let's remember, is the basis for all subsequent music, including the so-called modern music styles. We could perfectly say that Vivaldi sounds like modern music. This point is very important to understand what we will explain later about how Vivaldi's music sounded in his time. Before that, we want to share some little-known anecdotes. Vivaldi was ordained a priest in 1703, but throughout his life, he only celebrated a few masses. The problem is that he suffered from chronic asthma since childhood, which caused him attacks during ceremonies. In a letter addressed to the cardinal, he wrote, "I had to leave the altar 3 times before concluding the Mass." Finally, the cardinal exempted him from his religious duties, allowing him to dedicate himself entirely to music. In his time, however, it was rumored that his religious vocation was more for economic convenience than for devotion. Another interesting fact occurred in 1715. His opera Arcilda was blocked by the Venetian censor because the main character Arcilda fell in love with another woman, a woman who was passing as a man, in a first known case of lesbian love in opera. On the other hand, we were close to never being able to hear his music. What happened was the following. After his death in 1741, his manuscripts were acquired by Count Giacomo Durazzo, a noble patron of the arts. However, a descendant of his, another count, included in his will a special clause that prohibited the performance and publication of Vivaldi's works, probably due to family or legal disputes. So it was not until 1926, that is, in the middle of the 20th century, that the disappeared and forgotten Vivaldi resurfaced from his ashes, so to speak. Vivaldi died poor, and also, like Mozart, was anonymously buried in a common grave. Of course, we have to talk about Vivaldi's orchestra of girls and young ladies. L'Hospital della Pietà was an orphanage for abandoned girls who received a high-level education, and the most talented in music formed a choir and an elite orchestra. The orchestra consisted of about 40 girls who performed his music behind a lattice, hidden from the public to maintain modesty and anonymity. Their fame was such that many nobles and travelers from all over Europe went to Venice exclusively to hear them. We have the testimony of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the famous French philosopher and writer, who described them in his memoirs. He wrote, among other words, "I have never heard anything so moving. We are reaching the point of our revelation." During the Baroque period, all composers were performers of their own works. Additionally, improvisation was essential. They improvised with total naturalness. We must also place ourselves in an era where live performance was the only possibility that existed for the public. Without radio, without television, without records, without the internet, we have only a few testimonies from the time about how Vivaldi sounded. A German architect and music enthusiast, for example, described in his travel diary a performance by Vivaldi in Venice. He highlighted that Vivaldi played a free fantasy, that is, an improvisation that left him absolutely astonished. What does this mean? All the work that Vivaldi left us in his scores was only the harmonic and melodic skeleton on which he improvised freely and extraordinarily in his concerts. These improvisations were the only thing the public of his time heard and knew.
We have the pleasure of having with us a special guest, the young and extraordinary violinist José Fraguas, who has been winning significant national competitions since he was young, and a few years later became a winner and finalist in numerous international competitions.
Thank you so much for having me in this interview.
I will commence by posing an inquiry concerning the number of hours that are truly essential for practicing and studying the violin. For instance, I referenced Jascha Heifetz, one of the renowned violinists of the 20th century, who stated that practicing for more than 3 hours a day was actually counterproductive. His instructor, Professor Leopold Auer, mentioned that if you practice solely with your fingers, you will require the entire day. But if you engage your mind, just a few hours will suffice. What do you think?
If you have a mind like that, a bit artistic, then all the routine stuff becomes complicated, but it's necessary. When a couple of days go by without playing, you can already tell. After 2 days, no one notices. After 3 days, you notice. And on the 4th day, the audience notices. It is evident that consistent daily practice of the violin is essential. In my case, it involves rigorous practice. My instructors are all trained in the same hour technique, and I concur with the theory that a compulsory study session of 2 to 3 hours each day is necessary. And that study must be very intelligent, well thought out, deeply considered, and at 100% of our mental capacity. This is indeed stated by all educators, scientists, psychologists, and others, that the concentration of an adult in training can last 40 minutes at 100%. There are times when you will study more and times when you will study less. During the day, you remain a musician. Therefore, mental study is very important. Also, think about your music.
Upon the conclusion of our performance at the National Auditorium featuring Vivaldi's Four Seasons, I inquired out of sheer curiosity about the specific violin you were utilizing. And you responded by saying, "Well, it is merely a basic study instrument at the moment, and I found myself quite astonished." On this topic, there are many famous stories about top musicians like Pablo Casals, Rostropovich, Afran, Cunelo, and also Oistrach, Kogan, and Menuhin with the violin. Even though they recorded and played concerts with various violins, it's impossible to tell which violin they used just by listening.
Yeah, the sound is produced by the musician as it should be, being able to get a good sound out of a mediocre violin, and with a good violin, you obviously have more ease, more projection, and more resonant harmonics. However, it also depends on who has played it, because if a Stradivarius has been mistreated, it can be worthless. This subject of discovering your unique sound is of utmost importance, as ultimately, we frequently assume that a soloist performing with an orchestra must possess a highly expensive violin because it needs to resonate more powerfully than the whole orchestra. A violin will never sound louder than 40 violins. What makes Eloyen hear you in relation to the orchestra is not that you are playing louder than the orchestra, but that you are playing with a different texture than the orchestra. The vibrato, the bow, of course, the bow is what generates all the sound, and the whole orchestra is playing black while you play white. That's what makes you stand out compared to an orchestra. Then, as a violinist, you will initially be heard differently in chamber settings. A solo violin, of course, gives you more freedom. Also, for example, there are concerts that help more, others that help less. There are very violin-centric concerts, like Paganini's concert, where the orchestra, let's say in quotes, does little more than accompany, and the violin will definitely be heard. Then in a Brahms concert, you have to work more, especially vocally, on a personal sound. Close your eyes and know that this is Oistrakh, know that this is Hype, know that this is Milstein.
Yes, I completely agree. Changing the subject, can you tell us a funny or interesting anecdote of what has happened to you?
Well, the initial one was when I performed alongside Shlomo Mintz, who was accustomed to collaborating with numerous orchestras. He operated with the bare minimum, conducting a brief 10-minute rehearsal, mentioned 3 significant points, and that was all. You have to perform 200 concerts annually. Sure, you need to simplify as much as you can. A funny thing happened when I was 12 or 13. I was learning a new technique with my main Russian teacher, Sergei Fatkul, who taught me to play without a shoulder rest and similar things. And that transition can be somewhat intricate when you're accustomed to using the shoulder rest. I was just a tad inspired at that moment, and all of a sudden, during a prolonged harmonic note, I relaxed and felt a surge of inspiration, and then the bow slipped, causing the violin to go flying. There goes the anecdote. Well, at least that happened at home.
I wanted to inquire about something slightly more philosophical. What would you say is your most profound desire in a general sense, and also in terms of your musical aspirations?
I believe that in life we have many dreams that come up and we must fulfill them. That's the most important thing. And musically, based on that same principle, to keep performing concerts everywhere. I'm currently finishing a doctorate.
Let's step away from the typical interview between musicians. And I'm going to ask you, for example, what do you like to eat?
I generally consider the kitchen a small laboratory. I really enjoy cooking. It relaxes me when I'm stressed or even in my daily routine. So I go into the kitchen and start cooking. I thoroughly enjoy eating well, especially Italian cuisine. I like it, but generally I prefer cooking at home.
Fantastic. Cooking at home is the healthiest option. Thank you for being here. It has been a pleasure. We'll see each other at the next concert.
To conclude this episode, we will leave you with music. First, my customary melody on the cello, and then a wonderful melody on the violin with José Fraguas, which will also move you. The cello piece is my version of the famous Adagio by Albinoni, which, as we already know, was not composed by Albinoni, but by an Italian musicologist named Remo Giasotto. I want to tell you that this is an exceptional case in the history of music, as he only composed this piece in his entire life. Due to its dramatic character, but also for its beauty and its deep and emotional hope, we are going to dedicate this famous melody, which we have titled The Symphony of the Forgotten, to all those who suffered and died in wars of any era, soldiers, victors, and vanquished, but also civilians, men, women, children, the elderly, for peace,